The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. King Charles sat at his mahogany desk, papers scattered before him, but his eyes weren't focused on the state documents that required his attention. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the empty chair positioned directly across from him, the chair where his beloved mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had sat for countless meetings over the decades. It had been 18 months since her passing, yet Charles found himself setting up the morning meetings exactly as they had always been arranged. Two chairs facing each other, 2 cups of Earl Grey tea prepared by the staff, and 2 copies of the daily briefings neatly placed on the small table between them. The palace staff had gently suggested removing the second chair weeks ago, but Charles had firmly declined. "Leave everything as it was," he had instructed, his voice carrying the weight of grief that time hadn't yet softened. The routine had become sacred to him. Every morning at precisely 9 o'clock, he would enter his private study and take his seat, just as he had done when his mother was alive. Back then, these meetings had been informal yet crucial, a time when the experienced queen would share her wisdom, offer guidance on delicate matters of state, and help her son navigate the complex world of modern monarchy. Now, Charles sat alone, speaking to the empty chair as if his mother could still hear him. "The Prime Minister wants to discuss the Commonwealth Summit," Charles said aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "You always handle these gatherings with such grace, Mother. I find myself wondering what you would advise." He paused, almost expecting to hear her familiar voice respond with one of her measured, thoughtful replies. The silence that followed felt heavier than the crown itself. His private secretary, James Morrison, had grown accustomed to these one-sided conversations. Initially concerned about the king's mental state, Morrison had consulted with palace physicians and counselors. They assured him that this was Charles's way of processing grief and maintaining a connection with the wisdom his mother had imparted. "Let him find his path through this," the royal physician had advised. "Grief has no timeline, especially when you're grieving the loss of both a parent and a mentor." The empty chair had become more than just furniture. It was a symbol of continuity in a world that had dramatically changed. Charles would often run his fingers along its worn armrests, remembering how his mother would sit with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap, listening intently to every concern he brought before her. She had been his anchor during the turbulent years following Diana's death, his guide through the scandals and challenges that had tested the monarchy, and his steady presence during the uncertainty of the changing times. "The press is being particularly harsh about the new housing initiative," Charles continued, shuffling through the morning papers. "They're calling it another royal folly. You faced much worse criticism, and never let it shake your resolve. How did you maintain such composure?" He looked up at the chair, half expecting to see his mother's reassuring smile, the one that had always told him that challenges were temporary, but the institution they served was eternal. The morning light had shifted, creating new patterns on the Persian rug beneath their feet. Charles noticed how the sunbeam now illuminated the exact spot where his mother's feet would rest during their meetings. She had a particular way of sitting, always alert, never fully relaxed, as if ready at any moment to spring into action should duty call. Even in their private moments together, she had embodied the role she was born to fulfill. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Your Majesty," came the gentle voice of Mrs. Patterson, his longest-serving aide. "The Archbishop is here for your 10 o'clock appointment." Charles glanced at his watch, surprised to find that an entire hour had passed. Time seemed to move differently during these morning sessions with the empty chair. "Tell His Grace I'll be with him momentarily," Charles replied, beginning to gather the papers on his desk. As he stood to leave, he placed his hand on the back of his own chair and looked once more at the empty seat across from him. "Until tomorrow, Mother," he whispered, a tradition he had maintained every single day since that first morning after her funeral when he had entered this room and couldn't bring himself to remove her chair. The palace staff had learned to work around this routine, scheduling appointments after 10 o'clock and ensuring that Charles had this sacred hour of solitude each morning. They understood that their king was not just mourning a parent. He was adjusting to ruling without the guidance of the woman who had mentored him for over 7 decades. The empty chair represented a loss that extended far beyond the personal. It was the absence of institutional memory, of unparalleled experience, and of a steady hand that had guided the monarchy through some of its most challenging periods. As Charles walked toward the door, he couldn't help but feel that his mother's presence lingered in that chair, in the wisdom she had shared, and in the values she had instilled in him. Tomorrow morning, he would return to this room, take his seat across from that empty chair, and continue the conversations that death had interrupted but not ended. 3 weeks had passed since Charles had established his morning ritual with the empty chair, and word was beginning to spread through the palace corridors. The household staff, bound by decades of discretion and loyalty, spoke in hushed whispers about their king's daily conversations with his deceased mother. Some viewed it with concern, others with deep understanding of a son's grief, but all recognized the profound impact Queen Elizabeth's death had left on the man who now carried the weight of the crown alone. Lady Margaret Hartwell, the Queen's former lady-in-waiting who had remained at the palace to help with the transition, found herself particularly moved by Charles's ritual. She had served Queen Elizabeth for 43 years and had witnessed countless private moments between mother and son. "He's not losing his mind," she confided to the head housekeeper one morning over tea. "He's trying to maintain the connection that shaped him. Her Majesty was his compass, and now he's learning to navigate without it." The palace physicians had been quietly monitoring the king's behavior, not out of alarm but from a place of professional duty and personal care. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had served the royal family for 2 decades, understood that grief manifested differently in everyone, particularly in someone who had lived their entire life in the public eye. "His Majesty has never had the luxury of grieving privately," she explained to the small circle of advisors who expressed concern. "This ritual provides him with a space to process his loss while maintaining the dignity his position requires." Meanwhile, Charles's conversations with the empty chair had evolved from simple updates about daily affairs to deeper reflections on the challenges facing the modern monarchy. "The younger generation questions everything we represent, Mother," he said during one particularly difficult morning, after reading opinion pieces that criticized the relevance of the royal family in contemporary Britain. "William and Harry grew up in a different world than I did. They see the monarchy through eyes that weren't shaped by duty alone." The chair seemed to hold space for these complex thoughts, allowing Charles to explore his doubts and fears without judgment. In life, his mother had been a masterful listener, someone who could process information and offer guidance without ever making him feel inadequate or unprepared. Now, in death, the chair served a similar function, a silent witness to his struggles and uncertainties. On a particularly cold Tuesday morning, Charles received news that would test his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. His private secretary entered the study just as Charles was beginning his daily conversation with the empty chair. "Your Majesty, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but we've received some concerning information." James Morrison's usually steady voice carried a tremor that immediately caught Charles's attention. "What is it, James?" Charles asked, noticing how his secretary's eyes briefly glanced at the empty chair before returning to meet his gaze. "There are reporters gathering outside Buckingham Palace. It appears someone has leaked information about your morning meetings. They're asking questions about your mental state and fitness to rule." Morrison's words hung heavy in the air between them. Charles felt his chest tighten. The sacred space he had created, the private ritual that had become essential to his daily routine, was now being scrutinized by the same press that had tormented him throughout his life. "How much do they know?" he asked, his voice remaining calm despite the storm brewing in his mind. "Enough to cause concern, Your Majesty. There are headlines being prepared about the talking king, and questions about whether grief has compromised your ability to lead effectively." Morrison paused, clearly uncomfortable with the message he was delivering. "The Prime Minister's office has called to express their support, but they're also asking for clarification about the situation." Charles turned his gaze back to the empty chair, imagining what his mother would say about this latest crisis. She had faced countless scandals and controversies during her reign, always maintaining her dignity while finding ways to address public concerns without compromising her private life. "Mother always said the key to surviving media scrutiny was to control the narrative before it controls you," he said aloud, causing Morrison to realize that even in this moment of crisis, the king was still seeking guidance from the empty chair. The irony wasn't lost on Charles. The very ritual that had helped him cope with his grief was now becoming a source of potential embarrassment for the monarchy. Yet he couldn't bring himself to abandon it. The morning conversations had become more than a coping mechanism. They were a continuation of a relationship that had defined his entire life. "Schedule a meeting with the communications team," Charles instructed, rising from his chair. "We need to address this head-on, but not in the way they might expect." As he moved toward the door, he paused and looked back at the empty chair. "This isn't over, Mother," They may not understand, but I won't let them cheapen what we had. The rest of the day was consumed with strategy meetings and damage control discussions. Palace advisors debated various approaches, from outright denial to a carefully worded statement about the king's grief process. Some suggested that Charles should simply remove the chair and end the daily ritual, arguing that the monarchy's reputation was more important than his personal comfort. But Charles found their suggestions increasingly frustrating. During a break between meetings, he returned to his study and sat across from the empty chair once more. "They want me to abandon you to save face," he said quietly. "But how can I explain that these conversations aren't about madness or weakness? They're about continuity, about maintaining the wisdom you shared with me over 73 years. As evening approached, Charles made a decision that would surprise everyone involved. Rather than hide from the controversy or issue a standard palace denial, he would address it directly, but on his own terms. The empty chair had taught him something important. Sometimes the most honest response to public scrutiny was to trust in the authenticity of one's actions, even when others couldn't understand them. "Tomorrow morning," he told Morrison as the day's final meeting concluded, "I want you to arrange for a small group of trusted journalists to witness one of my morning sessions. Not to photograph or record, but to observe and understand. If they're going to write about the talking king, then let them see what these conversations really represent." Morrison looked stunned. "Your Majesty, are you certain? This is quite unprecedented." Charles smiled, feeling more confident than he had all day. Mother always said that transparency, when done thoughtfully, could be the monarchy's greatest strength. Tomorrow, we put that wisdom to the test. The morning of the unprecedented media invitation dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over Windsor Castle. Charles had spent most of the previous night second-guessing his decision to allow journalists into his most private sanctuary. As he dressed in his familiar navy suit, the same style he had worn to countless meetings with his mother, he wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his reign. 3 journalists had been carefully selected for this extraordinary access. Rebecca Thompson from The Times, known for her respectful coverage of royal affairs. Michael Davies from the BBC, whose documentary work had always portrayed the royal family with dignity. And Sarah Chun, a younger reporter from The Guardian who had written thoughtfully about mental health and public figures. Each had signed agreements about what they could and couldn't report, but Charles knew that the real story would be in what they witnessed, not what they wrote. At 8:30, the 3 journalists were quietly escorted into a small anteroom adjacent to Charles's study. They could see through a partially open door into the room where 2 chairs sat facing each other, morning light streaming across the space where these now famous conversations took place. The reporters exchanged glances, each wondering what they were about to witness. James Morrison had briefed them thoroughly. "His Majesty will enter at 9 o'clock precisely," he had explained. "You are here to observe, not to participate. What you will see is a man processing grief in his own way, maintaining a connection with the wisdom that has guided him throughout his life. This is not a performance or a political statement. It is simply how the king begins each day." As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, Charles entered the study with the same measured pace he had maintained for months. He carried 2 folders of morning briefings and placed one on each side of the small table between the chairs. The journalists watched as he poured tea from a silver service into 2 delicate china cups, steam rising gently in the morning air. "Good morning, Mother," Charles said as he settled into his chair, his voice carrying the same tone he might use when greeting any living person. "I trust you slept well." The formality of his greeting struck the observers. This wasn't the rambling of someone lost in delusion, but rather the respectful acknowledgement of a relationship that transcended physical presence. Rebecca Thompson found herself leaning forward slightly, surprised by the dignity of the moment. She had expected something more dramatic, perhaps evidence of a man struggling with the pressures of kingship. Instead, she witnessed something profoundly human, a son who missed his mother. "The situation with the press has become quite challenging," Charles continued, opening his morning briefing. "They don't understand what these conversations mean to me. But I suppose that's to be expected. You always said that public service required sacrificing privacy, but you also taught me that some things were worth protecting, even at a cost." He paused, sipping his tea while appearing to listen to a response that only he could hear. Michael Davies, who had covered the royal family for over 20 years, realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, not just a private moment made public, but a glimpse into the very human struggle of carrying an ancient institution into an uncertain future. William called yesterday, Charles said, referring to his eldest son. He's concerned about the media coverage, worried that it might damage the monarchy's reputation. I told him that authenticity has always served our family better than pretense, but I can see the worry in his eyes. He carries the burden of knowing that he will sit in my chair someday, just as I sat in yours. The mention of succession and legacy seemed to hang in the air. Sarah Chun, taking careful notes, realized that these conversations weren't just about grief. They were about continuity, about maintaining the thread that connected past wisdom to present challenges and future responsibilities. Charles reached for the second folder and placed it near the empty chair. The Environmental Summit proposals are here for your review, he said with a slight smile. I know you weren't always convinced by my passion for ecological causes, but the world has changed so much since our first conversations about these matters. Now, even the most skeptical voices acknowledge the urgency. For the next 30 minutes, the three journalists observed as Charles methodically worked through various state matters, discussing each one with the empty chair as if seeking counsel from an invisible advisor. He talked about upcoming Commonwealth meetings, concerns about economic policies, and delicate diplomatic situations that required careful navigation. What struck all three observers was the thoughtfulness of his approach. He wasn't simply talking to himself, but rather engaging in what appeared to be a genuine dialogue, complete with pauses for consideration and moments of reflection. The Archbishop suggested that I might consider making these conversations more public, Charles said toward the end of the session. He believes that showing the public how I seek guidance, even from beyond this world, might help them understand that leadership isn't about having all the answers, but about knowing where to find wisdom. As 10 o'clock approached, Charles began gathering the papers and folders. Until tomorrow, Mother, he said, just as he had every morning for the past several months. But, before standing, he turned toward the anteroom where the journalists waited. I hope you've seen what you came to see, he said directly to them, his voice carrying both vulnerability and strength. The three reporters were escorted to a nearby conference room where they sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Rebecca Thompson was the first to speak. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that. There's nothing mad or concerning about what we just witnessed. It was beautiful, actually. Michael Davies nodded in agreement. 20 years covering this family, and I've never seen anything so genuinely human. The Queen always maintained such perfect composure in public that we forgot she was also a mother, a mentor. What we just saw was grief transformed into something constructive. Sarah Chun, who had initially approached the assignment with skepticism about royal relevance in modern society, found herself reconsidering her assumptions. He's not talking to a ghost or lost in fantasy. He's maintaining a connection with 7 decades of wisdom and experience. In a way, it's the most practical thing imaginable. The palace communications team had prepared for various scenarios: criticism, mockery, concerns about mental fitness. What they hadn't anticipated was the overwhelming empathy that the three journalists expressed. Rather than sensationalizing the king's grief, each reporter understood they had witnessed something sacred, a son's love for his mother translated into a commitment to honor her legacy through thoughtful leadership. As the journalists prepared their stories, Charles returned to his regular schedule, meeting with the Archbishop about upcoming ceremonial duties. But the weight of the morning's exposure lingered. He had opened the most private aspect of his grief to public scrutiny, and now he could only wait to see how the world would respond to his vulnerability. That evening, as Charles prepared for bed, he found himself already anticipating the next morning's conversation with the empty chair. Tomorrow, he would have to discuss with his mother how the press had reacted to their sacred ritual, and whether his decision to share their private world had been wise or foolish. The morning after the journalist's visit, Charles approached his study with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The early edition newspapers lay folded on his desk, their headlines still unseen. For the first time in months, he found himself hesitating before entering the sanctuary he had created with his mother's empty chair. The ritual that had been intensely private was now public knowledge, and he wasn't certain how that would change its meaning for him. "Good morning, Mother," he said as he settled into his familiar position, though his voice carried an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "I suppose you already know that yesterday changed everything. The whole world now knows about our conversations." He reached for the newspapers with trembling hands, afraid of what he might find. The headlines were not what he had expected. Instead of mockery or concern about his mental state, The front page of the Times read, "A King's Love, the Morning Conversations That Guide a Nation." Rebecca Thompson's article painted a picture of a leader who honored his mother's memory by continuing to seek her guidance, even in death. Her description of the ritual emphasized its dignity and purpose, calling it perhaps the most human moment in royal history. The BBC's coverage, written by Michael Davies, focused on the historical significance of the moment. His article explored how monarchs throughout history had struggled with the isolation of leadership and the unique burden of carrying an institution larger than themselves. King Charles has shown us that strength comes not from having all the answers, but from knowing where to seek wisdom, Davies had written. Most surprisingly, Sarah Chin's piece in The Guardian, typically critical of royal traditions, was overwhelmingly supportive. She had written about the universal nature of grief and the courage required to maintain connections with those we've lost. In showing us his most vulnerable moment, King Charles has reminded us that leadership and humanity are not mutually exclusive, her article concluded. "They understood, Mother," Charles said, his voice filled with relief and wonder. They saw what these conversations really represent. He set the papers aside and picked up his morning briefing, but found it difficult to concentrate on state matters. The positive response from the journalists had lifted a weight from his shoulders, but it had also raised new questions about the future of this private ritual. Throughout the morning, messages of support poured into the palace. Prince William called to express his admiration for his father's courage in being so publicly vulnerable. "You've shown people that grief doesn't have to be hidden away," William told him. Harry rang as well. He's in California, but he wanted you to know he understands why these conversations matter to you. The Archbishop of Canterbury sent a personal note praising Charles's decision to demonstrate that spiritual connections transcend physical presence. Mental health advocates reached out to commend the king for showing that seeking guidance, even from unconventional sources, was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. Most touching of all were the hundreds of letters from ordinary citizens who shared their own stories of maintaining relationships with deceased loved ones. But perhaps the most unexpected response came from an unlikely source. By mid-afternoon, a message arrived from the Prime Minister's office requesting a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding family legacy and governance. When the Prime Minister arrived at Windsor Castle that evening, he brought with him a revelation that would forever change how Charles viewed his morning conversations. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister began, settling into a chair in Charles's private reception room. "I want to share something with you that few people know. After my father died 5 years ago, I continued to call his phone number just to hear his voicemail message. I did this every morning for 6 months until the phone company finally disconnected the line. I understand the need to maintain those connections." Charles was stunned by this admission. Here was the head of government, one of the most powerful people in Britain, confessing to his own ritual of grief. "I had no idea," Charles replied. "I suppose we all find ways to keep our loved ones close. The reason I'm sharing this," the Prime Minister continued, "is because your public demonstration of grief and the need for guidance has resonated far beyond what you might realize. We've received calls from world leaders who want to understand how Britain's monarchy continues to evolve while honoring its traditions. What you've done isn't just personal. It's shown the world that institutions can change without losing their essence." As their conversation continued, Charles began to understand that his morning ritual had transcended personal grief to become something larger. By showing the world how he maintained his connection with his mother's wisdom, he had inadvertently demonstrated how traditions could evolve to meet modern emotional needs while preserving their fundamental purpose. The next morning, Charles entered his study with a new sense of purpose. "Good morning, Mother," he said, settling into his chair with renewed confidence. "I think you would be pleased with how yesterday unfolded. The response has been extraordinary, not just understanding, but genuine support for what we do here each morning." He opened his briefing papers and began to discuss the day's agenda, but found himself reflecting more deeply on the implications of his decision to go public. "I've been thinking about what this means for the future of the monarchy," he said to the empty chair. "Perhaps our greatest strength isn't in maintaining perfect composure at all times, but in showing people that even kings need guidance, that even those who inherit great responsibility must continue learning and growing." The morning sunlight shifted across the room, illuminating both chairs in its warm glow. Charles noticed how the light seemed to connect the two seats, creating a visual metaphor for the bridge between past wisdom and present challenges that his conversations represented. There's something else, Mother, Charles said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I've decided that these conversations shouldn't remain private forever. Not because the press demands it, but because there's value in showing people how we honor those who came before us while facing the challenges that lie ahead. As 10 o'clock approached and Charles prepared to end their morning session, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Tomorrow, I'm going to invite William to join us. Not to replace you, but to help him understand how guidance passes from one generation to the next. These chairs have witnessed decades of wisdom being shared. Perhaps it's time to ensure that tradition continues. The empty chair seemed to radiate approval in the morning light, and Charles felt more certain than ever that his mother's legacy lived not in maintaining exactly what had been, but in adapting timeless wisdom to meet contemporary needs. The conversations would continue, but they would evolve, just as the monarchy itself must evolve while honoring its deepest purposes. That evening, as Charles reflected on the dramatic changes of the past few days, he realized that his grief had transformed into something more powerful, a bridge between the past and the future, between personal loss and public service, between the human need for connection and the institutional requirement for leadership. 6 months had passed since Charles first allowed the world to witness his morning conversations with his mother's empty chair. What began as a private ritual of grief had evolved into something far more significant, a new tradition that honored the past while embracing the future. The study at Windsor Castle now hosted 3 chairs arranged in a careful triangle, with Queen Elizabeth's original chair remaining in its place of honor, flanked by seats for Charles and William. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. When Charles first invited William to join the morning sessions, his son had been uncertain about participating in something so deeply personal to his father's grief process. "I don't want to intrude on your time with grandmother," William had said during their first conversation about the arrangement. But Charles had explained that the conversations were never meant to be exclusive. They were about preserving and passing forward the institutional wisdom that had guided the monarchy for generations. "Good morning, Mother," Charles said as he entered the study on this particular Tuesday morning, followed by William. The routine had adapted to accommodate both men while maintaining its essential purpose. Charles still arrived first, preparing the tea and laying out the daily briefings, but now he prepared materials for 3 rather than 2. "Good morning, Grandmother," William added, settling into his chair with a respect that had grown deeper over the months of participation. Initially, he had felt awkward speaking to the empty chair, but gradually he came to understand what his father had known all along. These weren't conversations with a ghost, but dialogues with the accumulated wisdom of 7 decades of exemplary service. "The Commonwealth Summit approaches," Charles began, opening the morning's discussion. "The agenda includes some challenging topics: climate change initiatives, trade relationships, and questions about the future relevance of the Commonwealth itself. Mother, you navigated these waters with such skill. William, what are your thoughts on how we should approach these discussions?" This was how their conversations had evolved. Charles would present issues and seek guidance from his mother's memory, while simultaneously engaging William in the decision-making process. The empty chair served as both a source of inherited wisdom and a witness to the preparation of future leadership. William had initially been surprised by how naturally the conversations flowed. "The economic advisors are concerned about the costs of the environmental initiatives," he said, referring to his morning briefing papers. "But Grandmother always emphasized that short-term costs must be weighed against long-term benefits to the realm." Charles smiled at his son's response. Over the months, he had watched William develop a deeper appreciation for the complexity of royal decision-making and the value of considering how past precedents might inform present choices. "Your grandmother would appreciate that analysis," Charles replied. "She often reminded me that our role isn't to make popular decisions, but to make decisions that serve the long-term welfare of the nation and the Commonwealth." The public had followed this evolution with fascination and growing respect. What had initially been seen as an unusual coping mechanism was now recognized as an innovative approach to leadership transition. Political commentators wrote about the wisdom of creating formal structures for passing institutional knowledge from one generation to the next. Business schools began studying the royal morning conversations as a model for organizational succession planning. International media coverage had been particularly positive, with several foreign monarchies expressing interest in similar traditions. The King of Sweden had privately inquired about the format of the conversations, mentioning his own struggles with maintaining connection to his father's guidance after becoming king. The Japanese emperor had sent a personal letter praising the British monarchy's ability to honor tradition while adapting to modern emotional needs. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from everyday citizens who found inspiration in the royal family's openness about grief and the ongoing influence of deceased loved ones. Mental health organizations reported increased participation in grief counseling programs, with many people citing the royal conversations as validation that maintaining relationships with deceased family members was healthy and normal. "There's something else we need to discuss," Charles said, his tone becoming more serious. "The Archbishop has suggested that we formalize this tradition. He believes future monarchs would benefit from having a structured way to access the wisdom of their predecessors, not just through written records, but through continued dialogue with their memory and values." William looked thoughtful as he considered this possibility. "You mean make this part of the official transition process for future kings and queens?" "Exactly," Charles replied. "Imagine if every monarch had access not just to one predecessor's guidance, but to the accumulated wisdom of the entire lineage. These conversations could become a living library of royal experience and judgment." The idea was ambitious and unprecedented, but both men could see its potential value. The monarchy had always relied on tradition and precedent, but those had typically been formal and institutional. This would create space for the more personal, emotional, and intuitive aspects of leadership to be preserved and transmitted. "What do you think, Mother?" Charles asked the empty chair. "Would you approve of this becoming something larger than our personal grief and growth?" The morning light, now familiar in its patterns, seemed to dance approvingly across the room. William had come to recognize these moments when his father felt particularly connected to his mother's memory, and he had learned to respect the depth of communication that seemed to occur in the silence. "I think," William said slowly, "that grandmother would want her wisdom to serve more than just us. She spent 70 years learning how to be an effective monarch. It would be a tragedy if all that knowledge died with her." As their conversation continued, both men began to envision how future morning sessions might unfold. Charles imagined his own son or daughter sitting in these chairs decades from now, seeking guidance not just from him, but from the long line of monarchs who had faced similar challenges. William pictured himself one day occupying his father's chair, with his own children learning to navigate the weight of inherited responsibility. "We should document this process," Charles decided, "not for public consumption, but for future generations. A guide to conducting these conversations, understanding their purpose, and maintaining the connection with past wisdom while addressing present challenges." By the time 10 o'clock arrived, both men felt energized by the possibilities they had discussed. The morning conversation had evolved from a ritual of grief into a blueprint for preserving institutional wisdom across generations. As they prepared to leave for their daily schedules, Charles placed his hand on the back of his mother's chair. "Until tomorrow, Mother," he said, maintaining the tradition that had started this entire journey. "Thank you for showing us that love and wisdom don't end with death. They transform into something that can guide us forever." William watched his father with deep admiration. What had begun as concern about the king's mental state had become recognition of profound wisdom about grief, leadership, and the continuity of human connection across time. The empty chair was no longer empty. It was filled with presence, purpose, and the promise that some relationships transcend even death. As they left the study together, both men carried with them not just the specific guidance they had gained that morning, but a renewed sense of purpose about their roles in preserving and evolving an ancient institution for contemporary times. The conversations would continue, the wisdom would accumulate, and the monarchy would face the future strengthened by its willingness to honor the past while adapting to present needs. The palace confirmed what the world had come to understand. The heartbreaking truth was not that King Charles talked to an empty chair, but that in doing so, he had found a way to ensure that the most valuable gifts of leadership could never truly be lost.